Imagine a world where every morning, families wake up wondering if today is the day the skies burn. For nearly half a century, humanity teetered on a knife's edge, caught in a silent scream of tension between two superpowers armed with enough nuclear warheads to erase civilization. The Cold War wasn't fought with tanks rolling across borders or soldiers storming beaches. It was a shadow war of spies, secrets, and the ever-present specter of mutual destruction. From the ashes of World War II to the fall of the Berlin Wall, this was a global chess game where one wrong move could end it all. Buckle up for a journey through a time when the world held its breath, and discover how close we came to the abyss. The seeds of rivalry, a world divided. The Cold War's roots trace back to the uneasy alliance of World War II. The United States and the Soviet Union, unlikely bedfellows, united to defeat Nazi Germany. But as the war ended in 1945, their shared enemy was gone, and ideological fault lines emerged. The US championed capitalism and democracy, the Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, preached communism and state control. These weren't just political systems, they were visions for the soul of humanity, and neither side was willing to compromise. The term Cold War was coined because no direct, large-scale fighting erupted between the superpowers. Instead, they waged a war of influence, propaganda, and proxy battles. The Iron Curtain, a term popularized by Winston Churchill in 1946, symbolized the division of Europe into Western and Eastern blocs. On one side, NATO, led by the US, stood for freedom and markets. On the other, the Warsaw Pact, dominated by the Soviets, enforced communist rule. The world was split, and the stage was set for a 45-year standoff. The arms race, building doomsday machines. Nothing defined the Cold War like the arms race. By 1949, both superpowers possessed nuclear weapons, and the stakes skyrocketed. The US had dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, showcasing its might. The Soviets, refusing to lag behind, tested their first bomb, Jo-1, in 1949. What followed was a terrifying escalation. By the 1960s, both sides had intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, capable of crossing continents in minutes, each carrying warheads thousands of times more powerful than the bombs that leveled Japan. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, emerged, a grim pact ensuring that if one side launched, the other would retaliate, annihilating both. By the 1980s, the US and USSR collectively held over 60,000 nuclear warheads. Picture this, enough firepower to destroy every major city on Earth multiple times over. Yet, the arms race wasn't just about bombs. It was a psychological weapon, a constant reminder that peace was fragile. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 Days of Terror. If the Cold War had a moment where the world stopped breathing, it was October 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought humanity closer to nuclear war than ever before. When U.S. reconnaissance planes spotted Soviet missile sites under construction in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida, panic gripped Washington. These weren't just any missiles, they could deliver nuclear warheads to New York or Washington in minutes. President John F. Kennedy faced an impossible choice: strike the sites and risk war, or negotiate and appear weak. For 13 agonizing days, the world watched as Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev played a high-stakes game of brinkmanship. Kennedy imposed a naval blockade, calling it a quarantine, to avoid the word blockade, which could be seen as an act of war. Soviet ships steamed toward Cuba, and American destroyers stood ready to fire. Behind closed doors, the tension was unbearable. Kennedy's advisors debated invasion plans, unaware that Soviet commanders in Cuba had tactical nuclear weapons and authority to use them if attacked. One miscalculation, a stray shot, a rogue commander, could have ignited Armageddon. In the end, Khrushchev blinked, agreeing to remove the missiles if the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba and secretly removed its own missiles from Turkey. The world exhaled, but the scars of those 13 days lingered. Espionage, the Shadow War. While missiles loomed, the Cold War's real battles were fought in the shadows. Espionage became an art form, with spies weaving webs of deception. The CIA and KGB, the superpowers' intelligence agencies, were locked in a deadly dance. Double agents, coded messages, and high-tech gadgets straight out of a James Bond film defined this era. Take the case of Oleg Penkovsky, a Soviet colonel who fed critical intelligence to the West during the Cuban Missile Crisis. His information helped Kennedy understand Soviet capabilities, but Penkovsky paid the ultimate price, executed by the KGB in 1963. On the American side, the U-2 spy plane program revealed Soviet secrets until pilot Francis Gary Powers was shot down in 1960, sparking an international scandal. Espionage wasn't just about stealing secrets, it was about sowing distrust. The CIA funded dissident groups in Eastern Europe, while the KGB spread disinformation in the West. Even cultural exports, Hollywood films versus Soviet propaganda reels, became weapons in this war of ideas. Proxy wars, the world as a battlefield. Unable to fight directly without risking nuclear war, the superpowers turned to proxy conflicts, arming allies to fight their battles. From Korea to Vietnam to Afghanistan, the Cold War turned local struggles into global flashpoints. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, was the first major proxy war. When North Korea, backed by the Soviets and China, invaded South Korea, the US-led UN forces intervened. The brutal conflict ended in a stalemate, with Korea divided along the 38th parallel, a line that still exists today. Vietnam was even bloodier. The US, fearing the spread of communism, the domino theory, poured troops and resources into South Vietnam to counter the Soviet-backed North. The war, televised in American living rooms, became a quagmire, costing millions of lives and eroding U.S. morale. By 1975, Saigon fell, and the U.S. faced a humbling defeat. In the 1980s, Afghanistan became the Soviet Union's Vietnam. The CIA armed Afghan mujahideen to fight Soviet invaders, turning the conflict into a draining occupation. Among the fighters was a young Osama bin Laden, a name that would haunt the world decades later. These proxy wars showed the Cold War's global reach, leaving scars from Asia to Africa to Latin America. The space race, conquering the stars. The Cold War wasn't just fought on Earth, it reached the heavens. The space race became a symbol of technological and ideological superiority. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first satellite, in 1957, it shocked the U.S. The idea of a Soviet object orbiting above American skies fueled fears of surveillance and missile technology. The U.S. responded with NASA and a moonshot ambition. In 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space, but the U.S. countered with Apollo 11. On July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong's "One Small Step for Man" was a giant leap for American prestige. The space race wasn't just about science, it was a propaganda coup, proving which system could dream bigger. Cracks in the wall, the decline of the Soviet Empire. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was crumbling under its own weight. Decades of military spending, economic stagnation, and internal dissent took their toll. The U.S., under President Ronald Reagan, ramped up pressure with the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, a proposed missile defense system dubbed Star Wars. Though never fully realized, SDI forced the Soviets to spend billions they couldn't afford to keep up. Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader from 1985, introduced reforms, glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, to save the system. Instead, they unleashed demands for freedom. In 1989, the Berlin Wall, a concrete symbol of division since 1961, fell as East Germans poured into the West. One by one, Eastern Bloc countries broke free, and by 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, its red flag lowered for the last time. Legacy, a world transformed. The Cold War ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. Yet its legacy shapes our world. The Internet, born from U.S. military research, and GPS, a product of Cold War navigation needs, are daily reminders of that era. So are the lingering nuclear arsenals and geopolitical rivalries. But the Cold War also taught humanity a lesson: survival is possible even in the face of existential threats. It was a time when leaders, spies, scientists, and citizens navigated a world where one mistake could end it all. They didn't always get it right, but they kept the doomsday clock from striking midnight. Conclusion: Echoes of a Cold War. As we navigate today's tensions, great power rivalries, technological races, and global uncertainties, the Cold War feels less like history and more like a warning. It reminds us how fragile peace is and how vital it is to choose dialogue over destruction. So, the next time you hear a news story about missiles or superpowers, remember the world that once stood on the edge, and the resilience that pulled it back.